Gothic surface, Gothic depth, the subject of secrecy in Stevenson and Wilde. Man is not truly one but two. I say two because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow, others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard to guess that man will be ultimately known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and M.R. Hyde. Insincerity is merely a method by which we can multiply our personalities. Such was Dorian Gray's opinion. He used to wonder at the shallow psychology of those who conceived the ego in man as a thing simple, permanent, reliable, and of one essence. To him man was a being with myriad lives and myriad sensations, a complex, multiform creature. The picture of Dorian Gray. Gothic humanism. The post-Frankenstein monster emerges at the turn of the century as a creature marked by an essential duality and a potential multiplicity. While we remark that the monster in Frankenstein is always part of its maker, always also constructing its author, the dialectic between monster and maker is resolved in both Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886, and Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1891, as a conflict staged in a single body. If the monster's monstrosity in Frankenstein depended upon the fragility of his maker's humanity, the hideous nature of Mr. Hyde can only be known through the veiled respectability of Dr. Jekyll, and the decrepitude of Dorian's portrait is only significant when juxtaposed to his own youthful beauty. In order to understand why the monster returns as two monsters, it is helpful and necessary to compare Robert Louis Stevenson's chilling shocker to its twin tail, Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. The two novels play out the drama of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by presenting the same history but in very different forms. One is, as Stevenson put it, the Gothic gnome, stunted, crabbed, ugly and designed to shock not soothe. The other is beautiful, artistic, born of aesthetics. In each book Gothic effect depends upon the production of a monstrous double, and in each the plot resolves itself into a tidy, if unconvincing, moral resolution. Furthermore, both novels were dubbed poisonous by reviewers and were reviled for both their forms and their subject matter. Man is not truly one but truly two, says Dr. Jekyll as he pursues his scientific experimentation. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde uses multiple narrators to tell the story of a man doomed by the chemical reproduction of his double. Dr. Jekyll, we learn, is a man tormented by a sense of the essential duplicity of his being and, indeed, by a sense of the thorough and primitive duality of man. To Jekyll embarks upon what he conceives of as a moral and scientific project, the dissociation of the polar twins of the self. Experimenting with various chemical compounds, Jekyll discovers a potion which, when he imbibes it, transforms his body into that of his other self. The other self, Mr. Hyde, enacts Jekyll's undignified desires and haunts the streets of London, a small and dark, indescribably ugly character. Hyde's menacing aspect and his violent ways lead him to murder, and Jekyll vows never to drink the transformative potion again. The metamorphosis, however, has become spontaneous, and Jekyll feels his respectable side succumbing to the evil of his double. The story unfolds through the narratives of Jekyll's lawyer, John Gabriel Utterson, his friend and colleague, Dr. Lanyon, and finally the last testament of Jekyll himself. The various narratives combine to create a mystery, the mystery surrounding Hyde. Who is he? Where did he come from? Why is he so evil? What is his connection to the good Dr. Jekyll, which can only be solved after Jekyll's death when Utterson reads the papers he leaves behind. In Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, the young man sells his soul to be eternally youthful while a portrait of him grows old in his place. Under the tutelage of Lord Henry Wotton, a cynic and a man of leisure, Dorian learns to take immense pleasure in a superficial life. While his painting takes on the appearance of depth, Dorian remains a perfect surface, a canvas stretched across his soul. Lord Henry appears as a kind of Frankenstein figure in this narrative, and he sees Dorian as a live experiment in natural science. To a large extent the lad was his own creation. He had made him premature. That was something but Dorian is also Basil Hallward's creation, since Basil paints his portrait and thus divides him against himself. When he saw the portrait for the first time, Dorian drew back and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes, as if he had recognized himself for the first time. 24. Dorian's desire to be the self he sees in the picture dooms him. By reading Stevenson's Gothic gnome alongside Wilde's poisonous book, I hope to read one as an inversion of the other and both as Gothic narratives of a self marked, not by its fear of the other, but by a paranoid terror of involution or the unraveling of a multiformed ego. But this is not a psychological study, not a psychoanalysis of these two dual egos. This is a history of subject formation within the Gothic narrative, which examines why and how these narratives seem to insist upon psychological interpretations, and why and how such psychological readings already assume the self that is in fact in the process of being constructed within the horror story. In other words, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde creates a self within the self. It constructs a depth to subjectivity, but we are prone to read it as a description of the conflict between man's inner and outer being. The Picture of Dorian Gray, however, works backwards. It critiques the notion that subjectivity is a deep structure, and it demands that we stay shallow, that we remain at the surface, that we take surface as truth, that we understand truth as always superficial, and that we cultivate instead an understanding of subjectivity based upon the lot. Critics have a tendency to read Dr. Jekyll and M.R. Hyde in particular as a morality tale about Victorian hypocrisy. Martin Traub, for example, in Images of Feet, compares the myth of Jack the Ripper and the fiction told by Stevenson in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in terms of the violence produced by a contradiction between outward appearance and inner reality. Dr. Jekyll and M.R. Hyde became a blueprint for speculation about the murders because both events, fictional and factual, conveyed, graphically and undeniably, a sense of the precariousness of a culture caught between outward respectability and secret violence. For hypocrisy, however, the tension between outward respectability and secret violence already assumes too much about the shared monstrosity of a Dr. Jekyll and Jack the Ripper. It assumes that the humanity of the subject, for example, is founded upon the three-dimensional form of subjecthood. It assumes that a surface of respectability is antithetical to a hidden violence. But perhaps it is only the modern reader who understands respectable to mean non-violent. Stevenson's story makes the violent, the criminal, and the destructive continuous with the respectable surface. Traub, indeed, in an effort to be historical, has precisely transcended history by making historical categories like respectability a cause rather than an effect of cultural narratives about Gothic selves. Traub continues, Stevenson's private nightmare and Whitechapel's public reality were parallel events and together foreshadowed the way the modern world has come to view human possibility. Random, purposeless violence is the ultimate horror of the city in the 20th century, a horror made possible by urban anonymity and the loss of community. 130. The idea of a foreshadowing and a consequent production of a new horror, of course, constructs a mythical time before when there was a community, that is now lost, and a more optimistic view of human possibility. I propose that we read one Gothic narrative, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, inside another, the picture of Dorian Gray, and allow the one to unravel the other precisely so that we may avoid a trench history. Cal and humanist reading of Gothic. Certainly fictional horror and factual horror are in some kind of dialogue, but they are not merely symptoms of the decay and essential monstrosity of humanists. Rather, they are narratives that produce ideological and interpretive strategies for readers to recognize the human and distinguish between human and monster. Gothic gnomes. Stevenson viewed Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a shilling shocker or a fine bogey tale 5 written very quickly to earn money. In an essay on the mass readership of the Victorian period, Patrick Bradlinger and Richard Boyle take Stevenson's comments to refer to the double bind of the artist torn between writing literary masterpieces and making money. Stevenson, they suggest, struggles with the notion that if his work is widely read then it must be deformed or it must resemble the sensationalist yellow press of the day. They write, Stevenson as popular author shares in the criminal popularity or populace-like nature of Hyde. There must be something wrong with me. The statement is, in a sense, the formula of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde itself. There is something wrong in the story that is Hyde and this accounts for its popularity. 274. Bradlinger and Boyle provide a provocative analysis of Stevenson's conception of his own popularity and they dissect the opposition of popularity and the literary and the juxtaposition of Gothic and deformity implicit in Stevenson's disdain of his Gothic gnome. What exactly is wrong with Mr. Hyde is not so easily explained, however, since he seems to be wrong in a multitude of ways. Like Frankenstein's monster, Mr. Hyde is visually repellent, but unlike Frankenstein's monster, his repulsive nature extends beyond his exterior. Hyde is born bad and he is bad through and through. He also represents the evil core of his author, Mr. Jekyll. Both Stevenson's book and Hyde are Gothic gnomes in that Hyde is dwarfish, 18, and ape-like, 27, and has a haunting sense of unexpressed deformity, 32, and the novel is very short, a kind of stunted work which, despite the obvious moral overtones, concerns itself with the dark recesses of the city and the self. The novel's very popularity announces it as non-literary within a Victorian context, and its appeal for a mass audience suggests that it must fail to satisfy the high cultural expectations that critics like Matthew Arnold espoused. 6 Stevenson's identification of his shilling shocker with the monstrous Hyde is reminiscent of an earlier connection made by Mary Shelley between book and monster when she dubbed Frankenstein my hideous progeny. We might say, in fact, that the merger of book and monster is a typical Gothic strategy, but it is also an identification that is repeated in many histories of the novel which make the Gothic a kind of degenerate cousin to the realist novel. 7 Gothic novels, indeed, play on. Stirred to the 3-volume masterpiece that represented art or culture in the 19th century. 8 Like other Gothic novels, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is not a masterpiece but a monsterpiece and, ironically, it tells the story of a monster hiding in the master. Like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and like Frankenstein, a mainstay of the picture of Dorian Gray is the connection that Wilde makes between art and monstrosity. The obvious metaphor of monstrous textuality in the novel is the picture of Dorian Gray painted by Basil Hallward, who is in love with him. Dorian wishes one day that the face on the canvas bear the burden of his passions and his sins, that it, instead of him, should grow old. His wish is granted and the portrait becomes a record of his life, his desires, his corruption while he retains the bloom of youth and purity. But there is also another metaphor for corrupt artistic production in this novel, the poisonous book that Lord Henry Wotton sends to Dorian, now his protege. Even though Wilde made it clear that his story is a morality play about the intersections of life and art, the public reception of the picture of Dorian Gray still turned the novel into a monster. The picture of Dorian Gray was immediately slandered by the press as poisonous, as filled with odors of moral and spiritual putrefaction, as obsessed with disgusting sins and abominable crimes. Wilde responded to such criticism by claiming that, far from being an immoral tale, his book was in fact too moral. He writes in a letter to the editor of the Daily Chronicle, "My story is an essay on decorative art. It reacts against the crude brutality of plain realism. It is poisonous if you like, but you cannot deny that it is also perfect." 10 The poisonous book that infects Dorian is supposedly Huysmans against nature, and it is described in the text as a yellow book and as the strangest novel he had ever read. It was a novel without a plot. 125. The yellow novel becomes an obvious metaphor for Wilde's novel itself, but it also becomes an uncanny double for the kind of monstrosity that Gray represents. Like the book, Dorian is perfect. He is all form and no content. Dorian is in some sense plotless because his life is not written upon his body but upon his portrait. He is beautiful but all surface and without depth. The allegory of artistic production that both the picture of Dorian Gray and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde tell makes the process of narration itself Gothic. While the poisonous book in the picture of Dorian Gray is offensive because it has no plot, the picture of Dorian is hideous because it has too much plot, and these two sources of disgust are both made more hideous by the fact of Dorian's own perfect beauty. Similarly, the relationship between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that of a terrible dependency between author and text, and Jekyll is depicted as a junkie addicted to his chemical production. Hyde is born of Jekyll, and yet, Jekyll's narrative, the authentic, realist, and conventional tale of a good man's undoing, is organized by and mandated by Hyde's tale. In the process of telling, of course, the Gothic and the realist stories become completely entangled, and instead of resolving themselves into two different lines of logic, they rise and fall together. Indeed, the narrative trajectories in both novels lead inexorably towards the blending of one identity into the other. Jekyll comments, "All things therefore seem to point to this. That I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and slowly becoming incorporated with my second and worse." 90. The profound entanglement of identities and genres in both of the novels I am discussing here suggests that textual identities mesh with physical identities, and bodies are bound up in souls, and perversions are inextricably wedded to respectability, and evil or immoral activity is continuous with what we call human. The task of each of these novels, however, is to unwind the messy skein of identities and separate out the good from the ugly, the bad from the pure, the perverted from the kind, the sexual from the spiritual, the beautiful from the unhealthy. But as much as the texts seem to manipulate and stretch their monsters, pulling them further and further from the jeopardy of human identity, the more the tendency is towards chaos. Monsters, texts, sexualities, and identities seem, like Hyde, to retract automatically to the slime of the pit. 100. And, like Jekyll, they are always in danger of transformation. For the brief moments that monster does stand apart from human, we catch a glimpse of the construction of identities, and we witness the ways in which Gothic deploys monstrosity to condense negative meaning into bodies with highly specific sexual, racial, and class codings. This chapter attempts to read the ghostly apparitions of homosexual, Jew, and woman when and where they enter and leave the site of monstrosity. Dress and disguise. The monster is always a master of disguise, and his impermanence and fleeting sense of reality precisely marks him as monstrous. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson makes disguise a structural principle as well as a thematic. He blurs completely the generic specificity that was supposed to separate the literature of vulgarity from the literature of sweetness and light, and indeed, he disguises one as the other. The Gothic tale is disguised as a moral fable, the moral fable is disguised as a monster story, but it becomes impossible to decide what or who is dressed as what or whom. This story, like the picture of Dorian Gray, is finally a costume drama. Some contemporary reviews of Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde call attention to the peculiarity of this novel's form and content, and to the sense that, like Jekyll/Hyde, the novel itself is somehow in disguise. Henry James, for example, uses very specifically sartorial metaphors to describe Stevenson's writing. There are writers who present themselves before the critic with just the right amount of drapery that is necessary for decency, but Mr. Stevenson is not one of those. He makes his appearance in an amplitude of costume. His costume is part of his character. It never occurs to us to ask how he would look without it. Before all things, he is a writer with style. James here makes literary style into a costume that both cloaks the writer and his subject, but that also becomes integral to the writer's identity. Elsewhere, Stevenson himself refers to literary form as so much plastic material. 12. But note that, in terms of Gothic writing, literary language is described in terms of its amplitude, its excess. Gothic seems to denote the clothed word as opposed to the near nakedness of supposed realist writing, which hesitates to call attention to its costume. He might almost say that the grotesque effect of Gothic is achieved through a kind of transvestism, a dressing up that reveals itself as costume. Gothic is a cross-dressing, drag, a performance of textuality, and infinite readability, and, indeed, these are themes that are readily accessible within Gothic fiction itself, where the tropes of doubling and disguise tend to dominate the narrative. If we apply this Jamesian metaphor of the cross-dressed word to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we have to situate Jekyll as a man who fits comfortably into his own clothes and is a metaphor for the realist writing that presents itself with just the right amount of drapery that is necessary for decency. Hyde, on the other hand, appears at one point in the novel dressed in Jekyll's clothes, and they seem to drown him because they are too big for him. Hyde represents the outrageously dressed up Gothic horror, a monster in lawyer's clothes. But he is also the costume that Jekyll assumes at times. Jekyll remarks, "I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor and to assume, like a thick cloak, that of Edward Hyde, 85. He also refers to Hyde as a form that he wears, 90. Writing is characterized very specifically as disguise in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Handwriting, at several points in the narrative, is held up as a witness to identity. In one scene, Utterson's head clerk, a great student and critic of handwriting, 38, is given an opportunity to compare Dr. Jekyll's handwriting with that of his minion Mr. Hyde. Guest comes quickly to the conclusion that there's a rather singular resemblance. The two hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped, 39. Here autographs and signatures become the inscriptions of a dual identity, and one is assumed to be a forgery of the other. But of course, both identities, and neither of them are forged. Each one depends upon the hidden presence of the other, and each must perform and inscribe the doubleness and instability of the identity they share. Moving back and forth between these two tales, one of Dr. Jekyll and one of Mr. Hyde, the text alternates between the two differently sloped handwritings as one tale constantly disguises or writes over the other. Jekyll's tragic tale of decline is underwritten by Hyde's sensational story of murder and mayhem. Hyde's struggle to liberate himself from the repressive force of the doctor is overcome by Jekyll's attempt to return to the cozy nest of professional camaraderie represented by his friends Utterson and Lanyon. The realist story of a good doctor striving for knowledge is shot through with the Gothic tale of sexual outrage and physical violence. Never one without the other. In case the cross-dressing performance that Gothic represents, Gothic as a perverse costume that the realist story is dressed up in, seems obscure, let us return to James's analysis of Stevenson's style. Having drawn the analogy between style and costume, he goes one step further. Mr. Stevenson delights in his style, and it has nothing accidental or diffident. It is eminently conscious of its responsibilities and meets them with a kind of gallantry, as if language were a pretty woman, and the person who proposes to handle it had of necessity be something of a Don Juan. 141. The significant aspect of this passage, of course, lies in James's characterization of language as a pretty woman, as feminine, as ornamentation that treads the thin line between pretty and garish. An amplitude of costume in such an analogy suggests a dangerous proximity both to prostitution, dress to sell perhaps, keeping in mind that Stevenson wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde hoping to make some money from its sales, but also to a grotesque transvestism. James continues his analysis of the writer as a Don Juan in relation to the seductive allure of pretty literary language. The bravery of gesture is a noticeable part of his nature. It is rather odd that at the same time a striking feature of that nature should be an absence of care for things feminine. His books are for the most part books without women, and it is not women who fall most in love with them. But Mr. Stevenson does not need, as we might say, a petticoat to inflame him. A happy collocation of words will serve the purpose. 141. Again, this is a curiously inflected passage in which James wants to claim the romantic proclivities of a Don Juan for Stevenson while noting that women seem to neither interest nor be interested in him. What serves as his love object in this passage is language itself, and a language moreover which is characterized by femininity and which can therefore allow the author to achieve his best effects without the aid of the ladies. I will claim here that Gothic, the amplitude of costume and the feminine guise which is worn by an author, plays homosexual to the healthy and appropriately garbed heterosexuality of realism. Gothic is the debased and degenerate cousin who calls too much attention to himself by an outrageous and almost campy performance of all of the tricks of the literary trade. Gender and genre here, and genre and sexuality, slide into each other as plasticity of form comes to define gender, genre, and sexual identity. But, as I will show in my discussion of the cross-dressing Gothic homo performances of Jekyll, Hyde, and Dorian Gray, Gothic reveals the ideological stakes of a bourgeois realism. Namely, there is no one generic form that resembles life and another debased form that deviates from the natural order of things. There are only less or more fantastic costumes, less or more Gothic interpretations of reality. As Arthur Simon said of Stevenson, he was never really himself except when he was in some fantastic disguise. 13. The fantastic disguises in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the picture of Dorian Gray are precisely what make each character really himself. Disguise in the picture of Dorian Gray is a little more complicated, but it just as obviously becomes a trope for homoerotic desire. We need to read dress and disguise in this novel against the backdrop of decadence. Oscar Wilde, of course, is considered to be one of the main representatives of the decadent movement in England, and the protagonists of the picture of Dorian Gray embody the kinds of attitudes and demeanors that were popularly associated with decadence and dandyism. Some scholars, like Regina Gagnier, link dandyism to high society and the aristocracy. But Richard de la Mora, in Masculine Desire, claims that the dandy has been misidentified or misplaced. Although some aristocrats were dandies, the dandy as a popular phenomenon is middle class. Dandyism was associated with middle-class uppitysm. Dandyism also reflects a loss of balance between the dual imperatives of leisure and work incumbent upon Victorian gentlemen. The dandy is too relaxed, too visible, consumes to excess while producing little or nothing. 14. The dandy is also, as de la Mora makes clear, too feminine. He unites, then, the thread of idleness and a delinquent femininity in a male form that is marked by its desire to be noticed. The dandy, of course, is a Gothic monster in the context of Oscar Wilde's narrative about the beautiful Dorian Gray. Like the monstrosity of Frankenstein's creature or of Hyde, the horror exerted by the dandy is multipurpose and primarily visual. He represents too much and too little, excess and paucity. The dandy represents the parasitical aristocrat and the upwardly mobile bourgeois. He obviously also represents the homosexual male. 15. Wilde characterizes Dorian's dandyism in terms of its fashion sense, fashion, by which what is really fantastic becomes for a moment universal, and dandyism, which in its own way, is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty, had, of course, their fascination for him. 129. His fashion sense, his charm, his foppery make Dorian a monster because they allow him to seduce men and women alike with his appearance of perfect purity. Vampire-like, Dorian lives upon the desire he consumes from his lovers, and he revels in the contrast between his own beauty and the evil and aging face on the canvas. 128. As his body becomes more and more a fashion plate, a place to hang costumes, so the canvas devolves more and more into sin and corruption. Dorian's affair with Sybil Vane reveals the real stakes that Wilde's narrative has in costume and disguise. Early on in the story, Dorian falls in love with a young actress. When he first sees her, Sybil is playing Juliet. Another time she is Rosalind wandering through the forest of Arden, disguised as a pretty boy in hose and doublet and dainty cap. 5. Dorian desires the girl obviously for her performances, and particularly for her transvestite performances, and he asks Lord Henry ironically, Harry, why didn't you tell me that the only thing worth loving is an actress? 5. Sybil's appeal for Dorian lies completely in her ability to be all the great heroines of the world in one and never simply Sybil Vane. She is even able to be some of the pretty boys of the world. But when she reveals herself to be just plain Sybil Vane, Dorian feels that she has killed my love. 86. You, she says, taught me what reality really is. Tonight, for the first time, I saw through the hollowness, the sham, the silliness of the empty pageant in which I had always played. 86. And it is precisely when the boundaries between the spheres of art and life are too dearly drawn that desire, for Dorian, disappears. For Dorian, and one presumes for Wilde, the surface is all that identity consists of. As Wilde quips in his preface, those who go beneath the surface do so at their own peril. Going beneath the surface is certainly perilous in the context of the novel where Sybil Vane and Basil both die because they attempt to break through superficialities and arrive at something real. Sybil, of course, thinks that theater masks life, and Basil believes that art idealizes life. Each one attempts to move decisively from one realm of meaning to the other, from illusion to reality, but each discovers that the penalty for making too neat a distinction between art and life is death. When he learns of Sybil's death, Dorian says, how extraordinarily dramatic life is. If I had read all this in a book, Harry, I think I would have wept over it. Somehow now that it has actually happened, and to me, it seems far too wonderful for tears. 98. Dorian, like Harry, never mistakes life for reality. He recognizes that life is more dramatic than theater, and he is rewarded with longevity. In both the picture of Dorian Gray and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, disguise becomes equivalent to self in a way that confuses the model of subjectivity that each author maps. While at first the model of a monster hiding behind a respectable or aesthetically pleasing front seems to produce a deep, structured subjectivity, in each the hidden self subverts the notion of an authentic self and makes subjectivity a surface effect. The important difference between disguise or illusion in the picture of Dorian Gray and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde lies perhaps in their conceptions of what lies beneath the costume. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it is obvious that Hyde is precisely the base costume, the foundation, for Jekyll. When Jekyll chemically produces Hyde, he peels back a layer of respectability and exposes what lay hidden. I'll return to the pun on Hyde later. But Dorian's relation to his portrait is a variation upon a surface and depth model. The portrait is all surface, but it gives the illusion of depth once it has begun to record the rotting of Dorian's soul. Furthermore, as Jeff Nunokawa points out, in the picture of Dorian Gray, the expression of homosexual desire cancels, rather than clarifies, the definition of the character through whom it is conducted. 3I3. The friction of surfaces, in other words, in this text is as likely to erase self as it is to construct another one. Each novel produces a form of Gothic subjectivity, that is to say, each text presents the ego as multiformed as either a series of shifting surfaces or a volume of buried depths. The relation between surface and depth in Wilde's novel is produced as a sexual relation. Secrets, sex, and surfaces. The profound ugliness of Mr. Hyde is perhaps matched only by the exquisite and perfect beauty of Dorian Gray, a youth who was certainly wonderfully handsome, with his finely curved scarlet lips, his frank blue eyes, his crisp gold hair. 15. But both Hyde and Gray represent a similar threat, the sexual menace of perverse desire and the epistemological menace of unstable identities. Extreme beauty and extreme ugliness are thus both linked to sexual perversity and specifically to homosexual proclivities, but they are also framed as disguises for unspeakable crimes. In terms of Mr. Hyde, perversity has dragged his physical form down to its most base constituents, and in Dorian Gray homosexuality announces itself as pure beauty unsullied by moral or ethical consideration. In the picture of Dorian Gray, and particularly in the subplot of the romance between Dorian and Sybil Vane, Wilde associates homosexuality with illusion and heterosexuality with reality. So, for example, Dorian rejects Sybil when he discovers his own preference for illusion and artifice over reality. She, however, would abandon her acting career for the love of a man. Basil, too, loved illusion, and the secret of his painting of Dorian is that I am afraid I have shown in it the secret of my soul, for he guards his soul and his painting, refusing to show either in public, and he comments, I have grown to love secrecy. It seems to be the one thing that can make modern life mysterious or marvelous, for Lord Henry obviously cares nothing for reality. He makes everything into an act. Being natural, he quips, is simply a pose. 5. Eve Sedgwick has made homosexuality an integral feature of Gothic horror. She calls attention to the paranoid Gothic as a genre fraught with tension between normal relations between men and perverse sexual relations between men. In Gothic, Slippage occurs between these two already unstable categories, and the monster, or the agent of fear, becomes easily recognizable as queer. The Gothic novel crystallized for English audiences the terms of a dialectic between male homosexuality and homophobia, in which homophobia appeared thematically in Paranoid Plot 16. Sedgwick points out that many of the early Gothic romance authors were linked in one way or another to some homosexual scandal. Lewis was openly homosexual. Beckford was driven out of England for homosexual philandering. Walpole was linked to homosexual attachments. Homosexuality, still according to Sedgwick, becomes equivalent to the unspeakable in Gothic romance and, we might add, by the end of the century, secret and unlawful desires are euphemisms for homosexuality. The secret and sexuality are forever linked, of course, but the 1890s legislations against homosexual activity and, as we will see, by the 1890s medicalization of sexuality. Homoerotic bonds between men, indeed, animate both novels and propel them towards the discovery of secret selves. Jekyll keeps a secret self locked away, a self that is defiled because it has forbidden desires. Male sexuality in both stories represents mirrored and narcissistic effect which, as we see also in the picture of Dorian Gray, is both homoerotic and paranoid because of the panic unleashed by the recognition of desire between men. Both novels are populated mostly by men who meet secretly, dine together, spend hours together. The opening scene of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde depicts Enfield and Utterson on one of their Sunday walks. Two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business that they might enjoy them uninterrupted. 2. Homosexuality haunts both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the picture of Dorian Gray. If Jekyll and Hyde are cross-dressing monsters living in and out of each other's clothes, Dorian Gray is the monster who never changes. His distilled beauty is the hallmark of his perversity, however, and the secret to his beauty becomes his sexual secret. The outrage that Gothic novels produce has everything to do with telling secrets. Again, the picture of Dorian Gray dramatises this preoccupation. It is about secrets, but it hesitates to actually tell anything. We do not learn, for example, the exact nature of Dorian's various crimes or the reasons for his friend Chambers' death or Henry Wotton's sister's death. We only know that Wilde has caused them. The hidden self of Dorian Gray is indeed a sexual self, a decadent self, a self too much preoccupied with art, representation, and beauty rather than life, experience, the common lot. Furthermore, a set of behaviors that earlier in the century had characterized the corruption of the aristocracy. Mr. Fairley and Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, for example, effeminacy, sensuality, love of art, uselessness, idle leisured existence, now came to stereotype homosexual behavior. While aristocrats were denigrated as parasites upon the middle-class capitalists, they produced nothing and did nothing useful. Homosexuals were seen as non-productive, fruitless, given over to the reproduction of art not life. The queer dandyism that Wilde exemplified, furthermore, emphasized the artificial over the real, art over life, and connected aestheticism to self-advertisement and an essential male femininity. 17. Dorian Gray is singled out first by Basil Hallward and then by Lord Henry Wotton as the perfect object for artistic and aesthetic contemplation. Basil's desire for Dorian is immediately annexed to secrecy. He attempts, in the novel's opening scene, to keep Dorian Gray's name from Henry. In order for something to be desired in this novel, it must also be forbidden and silenced. Basil immediately connects the painting of Dorian Gray to the secret of my own soul and fears that he must not show it because he will reveal his soul. It is not until much later that he tells Dorian his secret, but I know that as I worked at it, every flake and film of color seemed to me to reveal my secret. I grew afraid that others would know of my idolatry. I felt, Dorian, that I had told too much, that I had put too much of myself into it. 114. Basil's secret is his love for Dorian as art object, his love for beauty, and his love for male beauty in particular. While Basil's secret, then, is his desire for Dorian, Dorian's secret is his own portrait. Desire, in this narrative, one might say, is the secret that art tells and that the subject conceals. Secrecy, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is irrevocably annexed to the persona of Mr. Hyde. Hyde's name and his desire to roam the streets at night mark him as one who must always move undercover. Jekyll, also, is perceived as undercover or masked, however, when his servants spot Hyde in Jekyll's clothes. Poole, Dr. Jekyll's manservant, calls upon Utterson and asks him to come and intervene between Jekyll and his mysterious laboratory work. Poole tells Utterson that he thinks someone other than Jekyll resides in the laboratory and he tells of his fright upon seeing this person emerge. But, asks Utterson, how do you know it was not Jekyll? Poole replies, sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If that was my master, why did he cry out like a rat, and run from me? I have served him long enough. My master is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf. 56. Later Poole adds, there was something queer about that gentleman, that masked thing like a monkey. 58. Jekyll/Hyde's desire to stay in hiding, his appearance as if masked, announces an essential connection between secrecy and sexuality, conspiracy, and perverse activity. Furthermore, Poole's inability to identify the thing in the laboratory as other than not Jekyll suggests that Hyde cannot be classified, he has no place in the order and history of things. Hyde is the disappearance of Jekyll. Twice in his correspondence Jekyll refers to the event of his death or disappearance. The first reference to this occurrence comes in Jekyll's will. He writes, in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay. 10-2. The second reference is written upon Lanion's last testament addressed to Utterson and not to be opened until the death or disappearance of Dr. H. Jekyll. 44. On this occasion Utterson remarks, here again were the idea of disappearance and the name of Henry Jekyll bracketed. 44. The bracketing of Jekyll and disappearance makes Hyde a kind of surface effect, an appearance that marks the loss of Jekyll. Although Hyde hides within Jekyll, Jekyll is hidden behind the mask of Hyde and the difference is crucial to the staking out of their particular identities. Hyde is an eruption which disfigures and disappears Jekyll and Jekyll is the reimposition of order which silences and muffles Hyde, pushing him back into, supposedly, the dark recesses of the self. Hyde is hidden but also hides, his secrecy and need for refuge suggest the criminality that inheres to his lack of place. Jekyll, since he has a place, has depth and interiority, the depth of self, the interiority of conscience, and both are flattened by the appearance of Hyde, of what should have remained hidden. Having and hiding a secret self, then, ensures Jekyll's downfall. As much as the secrecy of hiding Hyde has to do with the Victorian conception of self and identity, it has everything to do with sexuality. In an essay that links Stevenson's novel to the new sexology in the 19th century and to the history of perversion. Stephen Heath writes, Hyde is not just the hidden but also the hide of the beast that he is. The animal, indeed, is Stevenson's cover, what he hides in to write his story. We all have the animal in us, the phylogenetic paradigm, but the animal is a representation of the male sexual which is pathological, perversions, lust, murder. 18 The animal, Stevenson's cover, according to Heath, unites race, the phylogenetic paradigm, with sexuality to explain the threat Hyde poses to Jekyll's body and to bourgeois cultural authority. Unleashing Hyde, Jekyll unlocks the beast of male sexuality and allows it to wreak havoc upon the streets and upon his own body. The ape-like Hyde combines perversion with the lust for murder, he allies sex with violence, and he produces within his own person a form and shape for deviant sexuality. In calling the animal a cover for Stevenson, then, Heath refers to the difficulty of representing perversion. Linking Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with craft-eating Psychopathia Sexualis, published in the same year, Heath shows that the problem in both works was not defining perversion but representing it. Stevenson, he claims, uses the animal image, therefore, to represent perverse sexuality in terms of a primitive and atavistic desire that reduces man once more to the status of animal. But, as I suggested earlier, representation is also a means of producing otherness as sexual otherness. Indeed, Sander Gilman has claimed that perversion is the basic quality ascribed to the sexuality of the other. 19. We can link the perverse sexuality of the other with the medicalization of sexuality as described by Michel Foucault. Figuring power and pleasure as a dynamic spiral, a relationship between surveillance and perversion, Foucault understands the medicalization of sex as both a restraint on sexuality and a production of perverse sexualities. Hyde's relation to Jekyll, in fact, depicts very nicely the spiral of power and pleasure identified by Foucault within the medicalization of sex. If Jekyll represents power, bourgeois power, Hyde represents the pleasure denied and yet produced by the bourgeois subject. Hyde is repressed, hidden, and yet he springs forth from the very body, the very desires of the respectable Jekyll. By conjuring Hyde up from the mysterious recesses of its own desires, Jekyll forges a relation to its own perversity, a sexuality that is onanistic, homoerotic, and sadistic, that imposes perversion upon a set of behaviors that he systematically disassociates from himself. Cursing himself for his secret desires, Jekyll turns to science to find a way to both pleasure and power, indulgence and repression. The doubled subject split between desire and respectability identifies power as the ability to be radically both. In the history of sexuality, Foucault writes, as in sexuality was a medical and medicalizable object, one had to try and detect it as a lesion, a dysfunction, or a symptom in the depths of the organism, or on the surface of the skin, or among all the signs of behavior. The power which thus took charge of sexuality set about contacting bodies, caressing them with its eyes, intensifying areas, electrifying surfaces, dramatizing troubled moments. It wrapped the sexual body in its embrace. 44. Hyde embodies sexuality as perversion and degeneration. Jekyll creates Hyde by drinking the right mixture of chemicals after experimenting long and hard in his medical laboratory. Hyde, quite obviously, then, is a product of medicine, a side effect of chemical experimentation. We can figure Jekyll as the power of medicine which precisely set about contacting bodies, intensifying areas, electrifying surfaces, and dramatizing troubled moments. He is also, of course, the agent that wrapped the sexual body in its embrace. For Foucault, medicine produces perversion in exactly the process that Jekyll uses to produce Hyde. Jekyll chemically creates a perverse body and then he spends the rest of his life trying to repress it and discipline it. In the picture of Dorian Gray, perversion is produced precisely as a secret, but in this text it is not a chemical substance that allows it to surface, it is artistic method. The malleability of the portrait of Dorian, its ability to shift and change, allows it to record the secrecy of vice upon its painted surface. Basil Hallward warns Dorian, sin is a thing that writes itself across a man's face. It cannot be concealed. People talk of secret vices. There are no such things. If a wretched man has a vice, it shows itself in the lines of his mouth, the droop of his eyelids, and molding of his hands even. 149-50. Here the secrecy of sin and its revelation is a textual event that takes place upon the body. The body that has sin written upon it of course is a monstrous body and a textual body, it is also a body that has been written. The textual event of monstrosity becomes here another chapter in what Foucault calls the history of sexuality, and the monster records the place and time that the perverse enters discourse. How is the doubling of Jekyll and Hyde different from or similar to the doubling of Dorian Gray and his picture? And how or why do we read doubling as a sign of buried sexuality in both stories? In both novels another self is produced through experimentation and that self takes over the original. In Wilde's novel the other self is an outer rather than an inner self, it is Hyde-like, all surface, a canvas, but unlike Stevenson's Hyde, the portrait exists apart from Dorian Gray. As we noted, while science separated Jekyll from Hyde and seemed to produce a repressed self from a surface self, here art serves to separate Dorian from his hideous other spatially like Hyde. The portrait is defined by its need to be confined, enveloped, hidden. Dorian, indeed, keeps it almost perpetually under wraps and finally stores it away in an attic or closet. The portrait is monstrous and looks of a thing to be hidden away in a locked room. 121. Like Hyde, the portrait must be housed somewhere secret. Hyde lives in a small apartment in the back alley behind Jekyll's respectable mansion. The portrait is banished to an attic room. The rooms become closets, but they also represent the relation between self and other as the relation between house and inhabitant. Hyde lives in Jekyll. The portrait lives in Dorian's home. The small closeted spaces also seem to represent on some level the unconscious, the dark space into which forbidden desires are repressed. Jekyll describes Hyde as knit closer to him than a wife, 101, and envisions the opposition between himself and his double in terms of the animal versus the spiritual. The relation between the two characters, then, is made explicitly sexual, a parody of both the maternal, Jekyll carries Hyde within him, and the marital relation, knit closer to him than a wife, and it is explained as a primitive condition of the self. The male, individual, in other words, carries within himself the germ of a primitive and animalistic sexuality which must be repressed for fear of endangering the very moral fabric of civilization. Hence, as Foucault suggests, one had to try to detect sexuality as a lesion, a dysfunction, a symptom, in the depths of the organism or on the surface of the skin. But the sexuality that animates the bond between Jekyll and his double and between Gray and his painting is not amorphously perverse. It is, as we have noted, specifically homoerotic. Secret selves, in Gothic, denote sexual secrets, secrets of the closet more often than not. Certainly. In the picture of Dorian Gray and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the Gothic monstrosity of Dorian and definitely of Mr. Hyde have everything to do with the sexual secrets that they represent. We cannot therefore explain the monstrosity of a Hyde or a Dorian Gray by saying that they embody sexual secrets, rather we must say that each figure creates secrecy as the precondition for sexual perversity. Many studies of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde comment upon the device of doubling as a way of representing Hyde as the return of the repressed that disrupts the unity of the self. For example, Gordon Hirsch, in Frankenstein, Detective Fiction and Jekyll and Hyde, writes, the novel's terror, then, comes from the fear of losing control over the parts of the self, from losing any sense of a coherent personal identity. 20. But of course this definition of the self as unified proceeds from the specter of its incoherence and not the other way around. Similarly, William Beater's essay in the same volume, Children of the Night, Stevenson and Patriarchy, makes male doubles a precondition for patriarchy. However, he explains male doubling or homoerotic desires in terms of unresolved edible complexes and therefore produces a psychological cause for material effects. I am arguing that, in fact, psychological explanations for human behavior are effects rather than causes of patriarchy. Gothic narratives, in fact, create subjects who produce pathological versions of themselves through extreme self-examinations and they produce, therefore, the sense that individual psyches cause material prescience. In fact, the monster, as the subject's double, represents not simply that which is buried in the self, rather the monster is evidence of the production of multiformed egos. Indeed, it is only the evidence of one self buried in the other that makes the subject human. The construction of the doubled subject, one trapped inside the other, is detailed in Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault. Foucault links the emergence of modern subjectivity to the disappearance of torture, public hangings, and all manner of public displays of punishment in the 19th century. Such a transformation, he claims, is related to great institutional transformations rather than simply indicating the process by which disciplinary measures become humanized too. As public displays subside in the 18th century, he claims, punishment becomes the most hidden part of the penal process and minds rather than simply bodies become the object of social control. Physical pain, the pain of the body itself, is no longer the constitutive element of the penalty. From being an art of unbearable sensations, punishment has become an economy of suspended rights. The hangman or executioner is then replaced by what Foucault calls a whole army of technicians, warders, doctors, chaplains, psychiatrists, psychologists, deonalists, etc. We might add lawyers and writers to this list. If the body is no longer the object of punishment, says Foucault, then something must take its place and that something is the soul. The soul is the effect and instrument of a political anatomy. The soul is the prison of the body. The novel, as I have suggested elsewhere in this study, is heavily involved in the process by which the soul becomes an instrument of political anatomy. 22 Gothic novels, because they emphasize and dwell upon the unnatural relations between inside and outside. Because they chart the transition of inside to outside, because they turn bodies and minds inside out in their search for monstrosities, Gothic novels play a significant role in the history of discipline and punishment. The Gothic monster is precisely a disciplinary sign, a warning of what may happen if the body is imprisoned by its desires or if the subject is unable to discipline him or herself fully and successfully. The failure to self-discipline, as exemplified by both Dr. Jekyll and Dorian Gray, results in social death, outcast, and outlaw status, and ultimately, physical demise. The monster, from the monsterer, encourages readers to read themselves and their own bodies and scan themselves for signs of devolution. In the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Jekyll's strange case is not his body but his soul, a soul that divides against itself and becomes its own warder, doctor, educator. Jekyll's body is a disciplined body, a body that understands itself to be in the grips of conscience, under the higher power of discipline. Jekyll produces another self that must be controlled and imprisoned, kept inside. He realizes the trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience, of this so seemingly solid body in which we walk attired. 80. The body clothes the soul but the soul emerges and rules the body. I bore the stamp of the lower elements in my soul. 81. In Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, the body is obviously enthralled to the soul. Shortly after murdering Basil Hallward, Dorian tells Lord Henry, the soul is a terrible reality. It can be bought and sold and bartered away. It can be poisoned, or made perfect. There is a soul in each one of us, I know it. 215. Dorian's proof, of course, is that his soul has been extracted and transferred to a painting that sits in judgment over him. But Dorian, like Lord Henry, represents a failure of self-discipline, and that failure is linked to the fact that his soul is separate from his body. Without the sense that the soul is buried deep within, the body becomes all surface. Lord Henry characteristically inverts the values of depth and superficiality. It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. 22. Inversion, indeed, defines much of Lord Henry's speech, and it is interesting, therefore, that he provides one of the novel's most careful meditations upon the soul and upon psychology, the science of the soul, soul and body, body and soul, how mysterious they were. There was an animalism in the soul, and the body had its moments of spiritual ity. The senses could refine, and the intellect could degrade. Who could say where the fleshly impulse ceased or the psychical impulse began? 58. Lord Henry characterizes the attempts to separate mind from matter as psychological. He began to wonder whether we could ever make psychology so absolute a science that each little spring off life would be revealed to us. 58. Lord Henry precisely does not separate body and mind, surface and depth. He revels in the beauty of the superficial. He is never chastened or shamed, regretful or sorrowed. He never looks for meaning in depth or truth in reality. Lord Henry, the survivor in Wilde's novel, the one who gets away with more than murder. Lord Henry survives because he has no conscience. He is not available to discipline. Like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, of course, Wilde's novel does attempt to delimit very specifically where the mind or spirit ends and the body begins. But the splitting of Dr. Jekyll into Hyde and the division of Dorian Gray between his youthful perfection and the degenerate pain make tangible first the separation of mind and body and then their absolute inseparability. Dorian Gray sees the painting as equivalent to a reading of his subjective self, but the picture of what was he to say about that one had held the secret of his life, and told his story. It had taught him to love his own beauty. Would it teach him to loathe his own soul? Would he ever look at it again? 191. Reading and writing the self in both of these Gothic tales makes discourse the place where both the soul, conscience, and its horror, monstrosity, are produced. The picture, to Dorian, is equivalent to a narrative. Art, the novel tells us, must be unconscious, ideal, remote, not self-conscious, realistic, too close. The picture and Dorian and Gothic style, however, infect by revealing the ugliness, the pain, the violence of identity. In its most perfect form, art would tell no story. In its Gothic form, it tells too many stories. To be art it must have no plot, but its grotesque quality is that its line and shadows, its expression and composition tell of the love of Basil for Dorian. They tell of his abandonment of Sybil, his adulation of Henry, his sins and misdemeanors. Henry has no story, no secrets. He is like his poisonous book that infects by seducing. When Dorian shows the picture to Basil in order to taunt him with what has become of his artwork, Basil is shocked by the transformation of his representation of Dorian's ideal form. He sees the effect of separating out soul from body. He held the light up again to the canvas, and examined it. The surface seemed to be quite undisturbed, and as he had left it, it was from within, apparently, that the foulness and horror had come. Through some strange quickening of inner life, the leprosies of sin were slowly eating the thing away. The rotting of a corpse in a watery grave was not so fearful. 157. The painting that once revealed too much of Basil's soul now reveals too much of Dorian's. It does so by giving the illusion of an inner life that changes radically the composition of the portrait and creates its monstrous depths. Gothic effect in this passage is achieved by balancing surface against depth and revealing the dissolution of one by the other. Just as Jekyll is being eaten away from within by his hide, so the picture of Dorian is consumed internally, parasitically by his foul deeds. The representation here of inner reality suggests that monstrosity is precisely an internal, not an external feature. Frankenstein's monster terrified people because of his appearance. Jekyll and Dorian are monstrous because an exterior hides a corrupt self. In each case, the bad double is an inversion or an inner version of the outer self, but in each model of subjectivity, the depth model seems to give way to one that privileges a version of subjectivity as the shifting ground of various surface effects. Jekyll shakes the doors of the fortress of identity, and they give way to reveal that one identity imprisons another. Uncanny effect within Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has everything to do with the idea that oneself, Hyde, is housed within another. Hyde describes Jekyll as my city of refuge, 94, and Jekyll recognizes that, as Hyde, he is hunted and houseless, 96. By suggesting that identity itself is uncanny, that, indeed, the body resembles a haunted house, Stevenson's novel shows the ideological dangers of trying to separate the haunted from the spook. In the opening scene of the novel, Utterson and Enfield are out on one of their walks. The streets they pass along are noted for the types of houses which line them. One street, a place of thriving trade during the day, is filled with shop fronts which stand out like rows of smiling saleswomen, 3. By contrast to the dingy neighborhood surrounding it, this street shines like a fire in the forest. Utterson and Enfield notice, however, that the general cleanliness of the area is disturbed by a certain sinister block of building. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story and a blind for it of discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. 3. The sinister block of building, of course, turns out to be the refuge of Mr. Hyde. It is the backside of Jekyll's eminently respectable house, a place which wore a great air of wealth and comfort. 18. By symbolizing the 2 identities that make up Dr. Jekyll as houses, Stevenson makes a connection between housing and identity, facade, and character. The first chapter of the narrative, then, Enfield's story of the door establishes Jekyll and Hyde as uncanny in relation to their places of residence. Hyde's door is blistered and disdained a place, moreover, where a tramp slouched into the recess. 3. Jekyll's door sits among ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate. 18. While these decaying houses are divided up into flats and chambers, Jekyll's house alone was still occupied entire. But Jekyll's house, too, has become a fragmented dwelling, as the back door signifies. Between the front entrance and the back exit, furthermore, other divisions mark the space of the home as fractured. When Utterson visits Jekyll, for example, he waits for his friend in a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall warmed by a bright open fire. 19. This part of the house, however, is divided by an old surgical theater, or dissecting room, from Jekyll's laboratory. The dissecting room acts as a place of passage between front and back, home and scientific work, the light of bourgeois respectability and the shadow of a criminal underclass. The old surgical theater, one place for the dissection of human bodies after death in the service of medical knowledge, now signifies the dissection of the living body and the breakdown of holistic identity. Once Hyde has committed murder and has been identified as a refugee of the law, Jekyll becomes his only hiding place. The game of hide and seek, mounted earlier by the lawyer Utterson, if he be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek, IS, now becomes Hyde's mode of existence. Jekyll, as all that remains of the battered fortress of identity and of the crumbling stability of home, acts as a place to hide, and a place to hide, and the function he performs in housing Hyde produces in Jekyll a murderous anger towards his other self. In a gruesome parody of pregnancy, Jekyll carries his sleeping, brutal other caged in his flesh. 101. Never knowing when the horror would resume, H.E. thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as of something not only hellish but inorganic. This was the shocking thing, that the slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, that what was dead, and had no shape, should usurp the offices of life. 100. Here, indeed, the house is haunted and the ghost, the slime of the pit, the hell baby, threatens to consume his host. In suggesting that Jekyll is pregnant with Hyde, St. Benson makes the monstrosity of the Jekyll/Hyde transformation a function of gender inversion, and therefore connects bodily duality to sexual difference and a fundamental fear of femininity. The monstrosity, in other words, of a self that hides within one's body is specific to the maternal body, the body deformed and swollen with its other, its hell baby. Sexual difference within Jekyll's body breaks down, and it is the masculine body that swells with the life of another. Since he moves in an almost exclusively masculine world, Jekyll, as divided and dividing, becomes different from his colleagues and friends by becoming woman and alien, feminine and foreign. The combination of sexual and racial difference, as we will see, is crucial to the threat that Jekyll/Hyde poses to the bourgeois order. The relation between Jekyll and Hyde by the narrative's end, as Hyde threatens to swallow up what remains of Jekyll, is specifically vampiristic. Hyde feeds upon Jekyll, gains from him his energy of life, and arises from the dead to usurp the offices of life. The vampire, in Gothic literature, is always an unwelcome guest, and the vampiric relation between monster and maker is a part of what we are calling Gothic subjectivity. The relation between Dorian and his victims is similarly described as vampiric. In one of the most gruesome scenes in the novel, Dorian kills Basil Hallward by cutting his throat. Blood becomes the signifier of criminality throughout the scene. First, Basil attempts to make Dorian pray for forgiveness and quotes Isaiah 1.18 to him, "Though your sins be as scarlet, yet I will make them as white as snow." Dorian, enraged by Basil, rushed at him, and dug the knife into the great vein that is behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table, and stabbing again and again. 158. The body now becomes thing-like. The thing was still seated in the chair, straining over the table with bowed head, and humped back, and long fantastic arms. Had it not been for the red jagged tear in the neck, and the clotted black pool that was slowly widening on the table, one would have said that the man was simply asleep. 159. Like a vampire, Dorian has torn the man's throat out and let him bleed to death. When he later looks at his portrait, he sees a loathsome red dew that gleamed, wet and glistening, on one of the hands, as though the canvas had sweated blood. 174. Blood, the bodily fluid that marks the inside of the body, also becomes a primary marker of identity in the context of vampirism. As we will see in the next chapter, blood, in Gothic, is always overdetermined. It signifies race as well as sex, gender as well as class, and to have blood on your hands is to be implicated in the blurring of essential boundaries of identity. If Hyde lives vampire-like within and upon Jekyll, Jekyll also feeds upon Hyde. And if Dorian lives like a vampire upon the young men whose lives he ruins, they also feed upon him as the object place of secrecy, sex, and superficiality. Race and monstrosity. Henry Jekyll recounts that his discovery of his own dual nature makes him all too aware of the trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience, of the seemingly so solid body. 80. If we want to disrupt the notion that the hidden selves of Jekyll and Dorian Gray are not simply representations of repressed psychic other, it is worth considering what kinds of monstrosity are concealed by only concentrating on sexual or psychosexual monstrosity. Jekyll's hidden self is supposed to represent the base material of his nature, the worst potential of his character. The otherness that Mr. Hyde represents is a composite of a range of alternative identities, identities that literally subvert, overturn from below, the unity of the self. Hyde's deformity depends at least partly upon racist conceptions of the degeneration of the species. Critics have considered Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as an allegorical treatment of Victorian preoccupations with the instability of body and mind. Such preoccupations arose out of a popular concern with infectious diseases such as syphilis and tuberculosis, which Stevenson suffered from, and a post-Darwinian fear that evolution may be reversible, that, indeed, degeneration was both the symptom and the illness of the age. Race thinking in the second half of the 19th century attempted to allay fears about degeneration and infection by establishing what Hannah Arendt has called a natural aristocracy 23 based upon racial purity. As race thinking gave way to full-fledged racism towards the turn of the century, the body became the setting for a drama of blood. Issues of inheritance, in other words, no longer solely focused on class but now came to rest upon biology and upon the racial body, and predisposition to diseases like syphilis or to the possibility of degeneration were ascribed to certain races, such as the Jews, to their genealogy and their lifestyles, in order to give moral structure to the seemingly random process of infection. Nordahl, 1895. In an essay on film versions of the Jekyll and Hyde story, Virginia Wright Vexman notes that the cinematic depiction of Mr. Hyde very often produces a figure whose repulsion rests upon racial overtones. Ruben Momolian's version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, released in 1932, Vexman writes, conceives of Hyde as a primitive man and builds on a racial Darwinian undercurrent in Stevenson's story. 24. Jekyll's evil side, then, as represented by the dwarfish, dark, hirsute Hyde, maps the ugly onto the uncivilized and the evil onto the racially mixed. By making an essential and visual connection between race and character, the film and the novel suggest that human nature depends upon blood rather than circumstance, and they both subscribe to a sense of history as a series of fatalities. Indeed, in the 19th century, as writers sought general answers to the specific questions of history, Gothic writings contributed to a desire to pin politics, sexuality, and their separation onto biology. For this reason, Gothic becomes the place where we can most easily chart the conversion of class differences and racial differences and gender differences into a more neutral category of psychological difference. Gothic, in other words, tracks the transformation of struggles within the body politic to local struggles within individual bodies. The Gothic monster, moreover, as a creature of mixed blood, breaks down the very categories that constitute class, sexual, and racial difference. The idea of dividing world history into struggles between black, yellow, red, and white races was elaborated in the most detail by Count Arthur de Gobineau in essay Sur l'égalité des races humaines, 1853. Gobineau, a social pessimist who predicted the inevitable decline of civilization, believed that civilization was corrupted by the mixture of races and that, while racial purity was desirable, the races were already too mixed and the decline of the species and culture was now inevitable. Defining degeneracy, Gobineau writes, the word degenerate when applied to a people means that this people has no longer the same intrinsic value as it had before, because it has no longer the same blood in its veins, continual adulterations having gradually affected the quality of blood. 25. The popularity of Gobineau's particular brand of race thinking at a time when many books appeared on the subject may be attributed to his forceful polemic. Hannah Arendt notes, nobody before Gobineau thought of finding one single reason, one single force according to which civilization always and everywhere rises and falls. 171. The very specificity, in other words, of the essay marks it as an ideological tool, a foundation for later racisms. Furthermore, by making race the key to historical determinism, Gobineau highlights the body as the battlefield of history, Arendt, 175, and suggests that struggle within the individual is historical struggle. Although Gobineau's writings were not anti-Semitic or overtly racist, they did give rise to racist conceptions of essentially pure and impure races. As the division between races became polarized into an opposition between Aryan and Semitic, or light and dark, the light races were increasingly identified with purity and spirituality, while the dark races became the representatives of corruption, decay, and materiality or sensuality. 26 Fields as diverse as anthropology, linguistics, and comparative anatomy participated in ratifying race as the new key to history, Arendt, 170. The re-emergence of Gothic monstrosity at the end of the century coincides suggestively with the Gothic interdisciplinary interest in the racial body. Indeed, by the turn of the century, the Gothic horror novel, from the popular penny dreadfuls and shilling shockers to canonized works of literature, became a privileged site in the representation of potential dangers of racial decline. The battle for dominance between Dr. Jekyll and his other self, Mr. Hyde, suggests Gobineau's warring races within one body and produces a monster out of the threat that a wave of immigration in London in the 1880s posed to the concept of national character. Indeed, Stevenson depicts the body in this novel as no more than a casing for struggling identities. If Jekyll represents, therefore, the bourgeois individual, Hyde combines within its repulsive aspect the traces of 19th century stereotypes of both Semitic and black physiognomies. If, on account of its racial content, we read Stevenson's narrative as, at least in part, a text preoccupied with what Homi Bhabha has called the colonial margin, we can better formulate the disciplinary role of Gothic within a 19th century discourse on race. Race, Arendt has argued convincingly, substituted for nation at the turn of the century as imperialist expansionists attempted to justify their domination of other lands and other peoples. In other words, as the nation expanded to become empire, as Englishmen left the country to go to the colonies, and as a flood of immigrants entered England from Eastern Europe and Russia, national identity came increasingly to depend upon race rather than place. The colonial margin in Babha's conception of racial difference, as that limit where the West must face a peculiarly displaced and a center image of itself in double duty bound, at once a civilizing mission and a violent subjugating force. 27 describes perfectly the relation between Dr. Jekyll and his hideous double, Mr. Hyde. Hyde, as the dark side of Jekyll, functions within the novel as a stereotype of otherness. In other words, he embodies the traits of the ugly and the undesirable and makes those traits essential signifiers of evil. In The Other Question, Difference, Discrimination, and the Discourse of Colonialism, Babha theorizes the ambivalent mode of knowledge and power contained by the stereotype. 149. The stereotype, he claims, both fixes the other within racist discourse and recognizes the other as a danger and threat to all notions of origination and racial purity. The ambivalent aspect of the stereotype is, then, a function of the possible simultaneity of fear and desire within representations of otherness, a possibility that may be understood according to the Freudian fable of fetishism. 160. Within this fable, recognition and disavowal of castration allow the subject to maintain contradictory beliefs about an originary sexual difference. Difference, in other words, is both acknowledged and subsumed in a process which reestablishes a sense of totality, wholeness, and similarity. Babha's proposal that colonial discourse creates stereotypes as fetishes allows him to discuss colonialism as a discipline, as, in other words, a non-repressive form of knowledge which can sustain opposing views and contradictions. I find Babha's formulation to be very helpful in thinking about the productive nature of othering and the way othering always constructs selves, precisely because Babha, in his use of psychoanalysis, manages to avoid reducing all social and political difference to a psychological mechanism. Rather, Babha allows us to comprehend the ways in which social and political antipathies are constructed through and as psychic mechanisms. 28. He sees psychoanalysis as not only an explanation of the psyche of domination and submission but also as a description of what Foucault calls the implantation of perversions in the history of sexuality, Volume I. If the fetish is a penis substitute, in Freud's words, a substitute for the woman's, mother's, phallus which the little boy once believed in and does not want to forego. 29. The stereotype is a kind of skin substitute which glosses over racial difference and yet maintains it as otherness. That is to say, race and sex both circulate within the economy of the fetish. Babha shows convincingly that racial and sexual differences are denied by the stereotype fetish or the stereotype as suture. 167. Although the threatening aspect of both, the threatened return of the look, 169, is maintained. Again, the importance of this formulation lies in its ability to show the complex structure of racial stereotyping in relation to the various mechanisms of sexual stereotyping. Hyde is the fetish figure that Jekyll both recognizes and disavows. His appearance inspires hatred in all who observe him, although no one can precisely say what is so repulsive about him. Utterson remarks, he is not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance. Something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere, a deformity, we are told, in Years to Hide. His face carries Satan's signature upon it, his body suggests something troglodytic. 18. As a stereotype of otherness, Hyde must represent the non-human. As a fetish figure within the novel, he hides a lack, a generalized anxiety about identity, national and individual. The essential splitting of the self that occurs in Jekyll's transformation into Hyde makes explicit the duality of the stereotype. Jekyll is quite literally sutured to Hyde and ever in danger of slippage back into the dangerous other persona. In allegizing the potentially fragmented nature of a certain kind of subjectivity, The Others, Stevenson's novel both assures readers of the possibility of wholeness and yet confronts them with the fragility of the whole. Jekyll/Hyde may be split and splitting. But Utterson is another one, a total subject against whom the stereotype, the dark and evil other, cannot prevail. Hyde, then, is stereotyped in this novel by his physiognomy and by his essential role as other too. Jekyll's self. Small, dark, and ugly, Hyde manifests the evil side of Jekyll in a physical form that marks vice upon the body and makes an essential connection between sin and hideous aspect. The body, in this novel, represents the aesthetic space in which sexuality and race conspire to determine human destinies. Hyde as a racial stereotype fixes sexual and racial difference within a body which combines horrific effect with Semitic and Negroid features. Hyde's name, as we have discussed, puns skin, Hyde, with secrecy, and it is within this pun that the relation between race and sexuality becomes clear. While the sexual fetish remains a sign of the difference that must be kept secret, the skin, and specifically skin color, is difference that cannot be hidden. Secret and perverse motivations, then, the sexuality of the other, are announced by the ugliness of the outward appearance. Sexuality and race, desire, and blood, work in tandem to define otherness. Babha again explains this relation within racist discourse. First, the schema of colonial discourse, what Fanon calls the epidermal schema, is not, like the sexual fetish, a secret. Skin as the key signifier of cultural and racial difference in the stereotype, is the most visible of fetishes, recognized as common knowledge in a range of cultural, political, historical discourses. 166. Here again, the fetish does not summarize racial discourse or displace it into the realm of the sexual. The fetish reveals the multilayered process of stereotyping which functions through many different axes of representation. Racial stereotyping occurs metonymically and at the surface, sexual stereotyping occurs metaphorically and as a secret. Furthermore, the surfacing of one layer of the stereotype eclipses the other and therefore obscures the dual or multiple functions of othering. Hyde is both a sexual secret, the secret of Jekyll's undignified desires, and a visible representation of physical otherness. The fact that observers can describe Hyde's appearance, he is small, dwarfish, ape-like, troglodytic, a masked thing like a monkey, but cannot say what it is about him that gives such a strong impression of deformity, suggests that evil is both the most visible and the most invisible of traits. Jekyll's double has deformity hidden within him and blatantly inscribed upon his hide, his skin. Hyde's doubleness, then, the pun of his name, and the relation between himself and Jekyll, represents difference as always a function of both race and sexuality. Hyde's monstrosity, his hideous aspect and his perverse desires, transforms the politics of race into a psychological struggle between competing identities within one body. By reading the metamorphosis of a Jekyll into a Hyde in terms of Babha's colonial margin, we find that racial and sexual otherness are not hidden within respectability, they are produced by it. Keeping in mind Michel Foucault's analysis of Victorian sexuality as not a repressive system but, in fact, a proliferation of discourses. 18. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde contributes to a history of sexuality which generates otherness, in this case racial otherness, alongside bourgeois morality. While the racial discourse produced by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is not so obvious in relation to Dorian Gray's monstrosity, there is nonetheless a figure in the picture of Dorian Gray who is described as monstrous, and precisely in racial terms. Dorian is telling Lord Henry about his visit to the theatre where he saw and fell in love with Sybil Vane. At the theatre he encounters a monster, a hideous Jew, in the most amazing waistcoat I ever beheld in my life, was standing at the entrance, smoking a vile cigar. He had greasy ringlets, and an enormous diamond placed in the center of a soiled shirt. "Have a box, my lord," he said, when he saw me, and he took off his hat with an air of gorgeous ability. There was something about him, Harry, that amused me. He was such a monster. 48. This monster, the Jew, charges Dorian a guinea for his seat and then tries to find out if Dorian is a drama critic or publicist. He is naturally disappointed to find out that Dorian is merely a lover of the theater, and he tells Dorian that theater critics are in a conspiracy against him. Dorian concludes his harangue about the Jew by noting, he was a most offensive brute, though he had an extraordinary passion for Shakespeare. 52. What are we to make of the appearance of this other monster in the monstrous tale of Gothic production? It is not enough to point to the anti-Semitism of this scene, of course, rather, what is notable about the anti-Semitic depiction of the horrid old Jew, 52, is that the Jew's monstrosity is precisely a function of the same characteristics that mark Dorian as monstrous. The Jew is a parasite upon art, according to the text, he makes his living from the theater, he has pecuniary interests in whether Dorian might be a theater critic, and he sells theater for a profit. Art for anything but art's sake, art as functional, is punishable in this text. Dorian uses art to deflect his own corruption, and Basil uses art to hide or expose his love for Dorian. The Jew uses art to make a living and therefore is as corrupt as the others. But also, like Dorian, like the aesthetes and dandies, the Jew is depicted as parasitical in his inability to produce anything original. He is not an artist using art, he is merely a businessman who lives off the success of other people's art. The monster Jew is a substitute for the multiple monstrosities of Dorian and his dandies. He condenses, in one supposedly repulsive form, the economic and aesthetic violations that add up to monstrosity. He, like Dorian, is not an original, the portrait is the real original now, and he becomes another Gothic surface to reflect the breakdown of authentic and artistic subjecthood into an army of imitations. Conclusion. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was discontinued as a theatre production in R892 when Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of London. Critics felt it was inappropriate to entertain audiences with images that resonated with the all-too-real terror of the Ripper. The picture of Dorian Gray was used as evidence for the prosecution in the trial of Oscar Wilde on charges of homosexual activity in R895. In both cases life and art came into conflict and the text threatened to merge with the real. Monsters, indeed, tend to blur the distance between the real and the imagined, they set a fragile limit on the powers of representation, and they force us to consider the difference between real violence committed upon monsters by justice, as in the trial of Oscar Wilde, and literary violence committed by monsters upon respectable citizens, as in Hyde's brutal murder of the old man. The link between the Jack the Ripper and a Mr. Hyde, a Dorian Gray and an Oscar Wilde is unclear. The relation between representations and reality in these cases is what we might now call Gothic. It is negotiable, shifting, and unpredictable, but usually monstrous. I have been using the term Gothic throughout to attempt to identify the moment in writing when interpretation becomes monstrous, spawns monsters, and fixes othernesses in highly specific sites. The ease with which the monstrous form can take the imprint of race or sexuality, of class, or gender, as we saw in relation to Frankenstein, suggests that Gothic form is precisely designed for the purposes of multiple interpretations. We can read homophobic and racist discourses running through the body of the monster, and we can as easily find traces of sexist or classist constructions of subjectivities. What we should resist at all costs, therefore, is the impulse to make the monster stabilize otherness. What the monster does in the tales of doubled monstrosity that I have examined in here is to call into question the project of interpretation that seeks to fix meaning in the body of the monster. The texts are Gothic inasmuch as they make language or representation itself into the place of monstrous affect. Dorian Gray becomes Lord Henry's clay to mold when he is struck by the power of words, mere words. How terrible they were. How clear and vivid, and cruel. One could not escape from them. And yet what a subtle magic there was in them. They seemed to be able to give a plastic form to formless things, and to have a music of their own. 19. The plasticity of words that Dorian remarks upon recalls Robert Louis Stevenson's impression that literary form was so much plastic material. The word plastic in both contexts connotes the Greek sense of plastikos, meaning molded. The Gothic text is plastic because it makes monsters out of words, and it makes texts out of monsters, and it invites readers into a free zone of interpretive mayhem. The pleasure of monsters lies in their ability to mean and to appear to crystallize meaning and give form to the meaning of fear. The danger of monsters lies in their tendency to stabilize bias into bodily form and pass monstrosity off as the obverse of the natural and the human. But monsters are always in motion, and they resist the interpretive strategies that attempt to put them in place. And that, as Donna Haraway puts it, is their promise 30.